Yes, I'm starting recording now.
Excellent. Okay, everyone, welcome to this fifth paper development workshop. And this workshop focuses on how to write a results section. And as with the previous workshop, it will be divided into two sections, with me taking the first section and Professor Lisa Given, our esteemed guest, taking the second section. And really, I think this will be a fairly brief presentation on my part and a more in-depth presentation on her part, given the different idiosyncrasies in terms of how we write up quantitative and qualitative results section. So I will start with the quantitative results and I'll move through my slides. Feel free, anyone who has a question, just to interrupt me, and I'm happy just to stop my presentation and answer and engage with your question. So let me just start with a brief review of our our previous workshop, which focused on writing a method section. And as like today's session, you will recall from the previous workshop that it was also divided into two parts. In the first part, I spoke very briefly about how to write up a quantitative method section, and I articulated essentially four sort of key clumps of information that need to be articulated in a method section when you're writing a statistical paper. These include a description of the data, a description of your sample, how your sample was drawn, and perhaps some reporting of the basic demographics of your sample, and a short discussion of how your survey was designed and which items were used to measure which variables, with sort of labeling of your dependent variable first, followed by your independent variables and your covariates. And finally, a short discussion of the analytical or the statistical technique that was used to analyze the data. And you'll recall, I didn't speak any more than 10-15 minutes in the previous workshop, and the same will be the case for this workshop, because the truth is there's not that much in-depth information that goes into a methods or a results section when you're doing quantitative work. The bulk, probably 90% of your time, will be on your introduction, your literature review / theory / hypothesis section, and your discussion section. In the second part of the previous workshop, Afreen Hook, who is currently with us in the audience, thanks for joining us again, Afreen, spoke about how to write a qualitative methods section, and she focused in large part on drawing a qualitative sample and the various ways in which thematic analysis and categorization can occur vis-a-vis qualitative data. So with this brief review of the previous workshop in mind, I'm happy now to move into workshop 5. So as I said, I will be looking at how to write a quantitative results section in an academic paper. And as I've alluded to just not so long ago, writing this section is really as easy as pie. Now, I should qualify that statement by saying that quantitative analysis or statistical analysis is actually very difficult to do and very time consuming. So to actually carry out your statistical techniques, there is a lot of time and effort involved. But once you've actually carried out the statistical techniques and you've generated your results or your output, the actual writing up of a quantitative results section, I think, should take considerably less than a day. For me, the actual narrative part of writing up a typical quantitative results section might take 3 to 4 hours at the most, because essentially what you're doing is you're writing down in narrative form what's already reported in the tables in that section. So my advice here is, first of all, don't start writing until all of your statistical analyses are complete. Some people might be tempted to write as they do the analyses. For me, it makes much more sense to get a big picture understanding of what your results are telling you before you start writing up the results. Another point I wish to make in this respect is that it's perfectly okay if your results section appears as somewhat repetitive. There are only so many different ways you can report quantitative results, and you will find that paper after paper after paper, the reporting is essentially, I wouldn't say identical, but very similar. In fact, one thing you can do is copy and paste previous results sections, at least if you use a similar method, and then simply change around a few things here and there to tailor to the unique results of your new paper. But again, don't waste too much time on being stylistically out. It's about simplicity. Sorry, am I back again? I believe I've been kicked out. Can you all hear me?
Yes, all okay.
Yes, okay. Sorry about that. So I've been kicked out. I think I need to, am I still sharing my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so apologies for that. This has been happening with Teams recently, like in the last week or so. Hopefully it won't happen again. So as I said, in a quantitative results section, just say what you need to say, no more and no less. All you're doing is you're simply reporting what you found. That's it. This isn't a space for commenting on the significance of your findings. This isn't a space for talking about what you find interesting or what's not so interesting or what's value adding. You're simply reporting your findings. All those things about commenting on the significance or talking about what the key findings are, keep that for your discussion section. For now, you're simply laying out what you found. Now, when you're reporting the results of your relationships in a quantitative method section, you should include where relevant, and I include these at a minimum, the coefficients. So these are the essentially the results that describe the nature of the relationship between the variables that you're looking at. Effect sizes and p-values. So effect sizes talk about how strong or weak the relationships are. The p-values talk about the extent to which those relationships can be generalized to the wider population. And if you can, as well, include confidence intervals, typically 95% confidence intervals, so that you can, again, sort of reinforce the generalizability of your results. Now, what you're doing in a quantitative results section is essentially taking the information that you've already put together in your tables and describing that information in narrative form. So let's talk a bit about tables and figures, because this is really where you should be starting the process of writing up your results section. Before you write your narrative results, before you write up the story underlying your results, the first thing you should do is to recreate your tables and your figures where relevant. And you don't typically take raw output from whatever statistical software that you're using and copy and paste that. It's a good idea to actually put a lot of time and effort into making your tables appear pretty and clear and concise. So don't take any shortcuts when it comes to this, because there's nothing worse than a table that's been sloppily put together. So I've put a few sort of hot tips here when it comes to designing your tables and figures in a results section in a quantitative paper. Don't abbreviate your variables. I've seen a lot of people do this, abbreviating variables so it's not clear to the reader what that particular variable means. So where you can, where it's possible, use the full name of the variables. Make sure that your figures, so this would be especially relevant in the case of path diagrams or structural equation modeling. Make sure your figures are clean, and crisp and of a high resolution, right? Don't present a sloppy set of figures because it reflects poorly on the effort and the time that you've put into creating the paper. Equally, as with the figures, the tables themselves should be clear. They should be well organized. And I think it's important to highlight that don't use tiny fonts in your tables, because as a reviewer and as an editor, I've seen way too many times where I have to take a magnifying glass out to see exactly what's been, reported in tables. They should be large enough to read at face value. And make sure that all your figures and all your tables are clearly labeled, and where there are relevant notes associated with those figures and tables, they should be included below so that the reader can follow through with that information. So your results section in a quantitative piece should include, where relevant, both your hypothesized results. So these are the results that you hypothesize based on your review of the literature and your theoretical insights, as well as any post hoc results. So post hoc results would be results that weren't hypothesized, but maybe emerged as important relationships during the course of your analysis. And where you do post hoc results, it's important that you distinguish clearly in your paper between your hypothesized results and your post hoc results. Now, I think post hoc results can even be reported in a separate section or potentially even an appendix, right? So you can use appendices for what you might call supplemental results that may be tangential to the core arguments. I've seen far too many quantitative analyses that go on forever and ever, it seems. They never seem to come to an end because there's so many different ways that you can describe statistical relationships, so many different methods you can use. For me, it makes more sense to describe these as robustness checks, for example, and put them in an appendix so that they don't take up your word limitations in the article, which are, pretty stringent when it comes to most journals. And be very clear in your results section which hypotheses were accepted. So you can say hypothesis, H1 was accepted, H2 was rejected, H3A was partially accepted, H3B was rejected, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to make sure that as the reader's going through your results section, it's clear what your results are saying vis-a-vis the hypothesized relationships that you described and expected to find. So very briefly then, in sum, since there's really, as I said, not all that much you can say in terms of writing up a quantitative results section, I've put together just a few hot tips that I think will help you structure a good quantitative results section. Firstly, and really this point applies not just to this section, but really to every section of every paper you ever write, use short, simple, and parsimonious sentences. You don't need to impress people, especially in a results section, with fancy, sophisticated, postmodern language. If you can express something in 10 words, it's better to express it in 10 words than 100 words, right? So be short, simple, and concise in all of your writing, but particularly in a results section. Don't overthink it. Don't put too much thought into it. Remember, you're just describing what you found. You're not explaining what you found. The explanation can be found in the subsequent section, which is your discussion section. You're simply describing exactly what your results are telling you. As I've alluded to before, you can probably expect to invest more time in the creation of your tables and figures than the actual writing up of your results section. The narrative writing up, as I said before, should take you a day or even less than a day, maybe even a couple of hours. Having said that, it may take you a day or two, or maybe even three, depending on the extent of your analyses, to create your figures and tables and to make them look, as I said, pretty and concise and value adding. So don't take any shortcuts when it comes to putting together your tables and figures, because at least in my experience as a reviewer and an editor, the first thing I do before I even read a results section is I go straight to the tables and see what the findings are myself. And that's the sort of first impression that you'll make in sort of putting time and effort into those table creations. More isn't always better in a results section. As I said before, if there are results that don't speak directly to your hypotheses or the core arguments, include those tangential results in an appendix rather than trying to create 50 pages of results that really don't say all that much in terms of confirming or disconfirming your hypotheses. I know that there's a lot of pressure to do a lot of alternative methods and alternative ways of measuring variables and different types of robustness checks. That's fine to include all those supplemental analyses, but perhaps not in the paper itself, but rather in an appendix so that people can refer to it if they need to refer to it. And the last point I would wish to make here is that this isn't a place for citation, right? As I said before, you're not discussing the importance of your results. You're not talking about why they matter or why they are important or how they're similar or different to what other people have argued or found before. All of those types of discussions should be in your discussion and conclusion section. The only exception to this point would be in the case of a particular citation that speaks to the statistical technique or interpretation of a finding. In that case, it might be relevant to include a citation or two, but remember your results section is not a place for engaging with the literature on this topic. It's simply a space for reporting what you found. Okay, so that is my presentation, which I believe was about 15 minutes, what I was aiming for. At this stage, I'm happy to either take questions from the audience, or if there are no questions, I'm also happy to hand over to Lisa at this stage, and then we can take questions collectively at the end of our subsequent presentations. So, thank you very much for your time. And do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
I prefer to the next presentation because I'm qualitative researcher.
You are a qualitative person, that's right. Not a problem. No, okay. Well, as I said,
Andrew, sorry,
yeah,
can I jump in?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
When it comes to the quant results, you say that there is no room for any literature or aspects, but sometimes when the results are a bit divert from the what's reported by other papers, is that worth mentioning within the result why we report immediately, okay, but this is a bit different or surprising result within that and trying to explain it, or waiting for the discussion part?
I think no. I think you should wait for the discussion part. And the reason it gets a bit repetitive if you're highlighting, well, this is different from what these people found in your results section, and then reiterating that this is different from what these people found in your discussion section. As I said, the shorter, the better. The less engagement with the literature in the results section, the less repetition there'll be when you get to your discussion section. I don't claim to say that this is the only way to do things. This is just my way of reading papers as an editor and as a reviewer. And maybe there may be people who disagree, but in my view, that's not a space for discussion of what's interesting or what's unique or what's different. You should leave that discussion for your discussion section.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
No worries. Any other questions? Okay, good. So in that
Sorry,
case,
Andrew,
yeah,
Andrew,
go
sorry,
ahead. Yep.
just a quick one. Is there a number of table, like, and I don't want to say minimum, but maximum that you can put in a paper?
No.
Or we can, like, it depends on how many we need to support or not support the hypothesis. The first question. The second question that I have is, again, a curiosity. Like 10 years ago, it was enough to provide a table to justify, to support or not the hypothesis. And then slightly they change it, they ask a robust test, like to confirm, like so to prove that they want. And then recently, some reviewers ask us more robust tests. So they were not happy with only one robust test. They want another one robust test. And I would like to know your perspective on this one, and if we should do like already like a 2 robust tests to impress them and put in the appendix, or we go with one and then we wait if they ask more.
Yes. Okay, so the first question, is there a limit to the number of tables? I mean, honestly, the only limit is if you start producing tables that don't speak to your results, then you've gone too far. But I have seen increasingly, as you point out, that because of the increasing expectations in terms of methodological rigor and statistical rigor, I've seen tens of tables and figures. Many are in appendices. So I think, yeah, there is a limit only if you've gone beyond what is tangentially related to the results and you start, reproducing tables that don't really speak to what your topic is. But that limit is a pretty high number. And in my experience, for better or for worse, I'd probably say for worse, the more tables you include and the more figures you include, the more seriously your paper will be taken. Again, for better or for worse. And I'd probably say for worse in my own opinion. As far as the robustness tests, I believe that this trend was initially driven in large part by economists. Right? It's a very common thing for economists to do the same analyses over and over and over again, but just with slight differentiations, maybe different types of control variables included and not included, different types of covariates included and not included, different types of measurements of your variables, sometimes continuous, sometimes binary, maybe even different types of samples across different populations. This is increasingly going to be the case when it comes to getting, quantitative work published. It's not enough to simply write your multiple regression equation, report in table 1 your bivariate correlations, and then in table 2 your multivariate results, and then call it a day. Maybe that was enough 10 years ago, 15 years ago. That's not enough anymore. Just to give you an example, so the paper that I'm writing in conjunction with this workshop series is a paper that uses neural network analyses, like kind of machine learning or artificial intelligence, to predict the risk of suicidal ideation among different types of employees. And it, as much as that's, I think, a pretty esoteric method to use, not a lot of people use it, at least in HRM, that's not enough. So in addition, I include all these robustness tests about using logistic regression, binary logistic regression, which essentially does the same thing as the artificial neural networks, but using a different statistical technique, right, based on maximum likelihood expectation. Did I need to do that? Again, 10 years ago, probably not, but increasingly editors and reviewers are looking for an answer to the question, have you exhausted every possible technique or method at your disposal to analyze these results? And if you can answer yes to that question, you've probably ticked a box in terms of assuaging some of their concerns about your statistical methodology, for better or for worse. I think for worse, but I'm just going to tell you how it is, and that's how it is. Any other questions before I pass on to our special guest, Lisa, whose presentation will be, I think, far more useful than mine, given again the simplicity of what I have to say in relation to quantitative results. There's a real art involved in the qualitative side in terms of telling a story in your results section, and I think this is where Lisa can add value that I certainly can't. So without further ado, I'm happy to pass it over to Lisa, and let's hear about how to write a qualitative results section.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to talk with everyone today. Topic near and dear to my heart, anything qualitative. I'm just going to share my screen and make sure that you can see everything. Can everyone see that now? Yep, see nodding of head. Okay, no worries. And it may be easiest if I kind of walk through the presentation first. I'm happy to go back to slides later, but I'm just thinking of juggling the presentation and Teams is always a bit of a joy. I wanted to give a little bit of background just to kind of where I'm coming from in approaching in this talk today. So I'm an information scientist. I do a lot of interdisciplinary work. I work with people across a whole heap of different disciplines. And, you know, a lot of the work that I do tends to be qualitative in nature. That's really, I always describe it to people to say, the questions and problems that I'm interested in exploring usually require qualitative approaches. But that's not to say I don't also do quant work. I do a lot of mixed methods work. I've done a lot of textual analysis as well. And it really, because I work on a lot of mixed teams, I'm sometimes, you know, looking at things like large scale surveys, structural equation modeling, all that fun stuff. But my heart is really in the qualitative, very human-centered approaches. So I have spent a lot of time in this space, and I also do a lot of work around research methodology development. So I spend a lot of time thinking not just about my results, but the way that we actually do this work. And I've made shameless plugs here of some of my work because I have done a lot of publishing just around helping people to understand how to kind of do research methods work. So I thought I would frame it because you obviously know Andrew very well. You've been through several weeks, but where am I coming at this work? And I'm kind of giggling to myself as I listen to Andrew speak. Almost all of his advice for quantitative, I kind of go, let me tell you the opposite of that. So where I see kind of the findings and discussion context is very much in this space of item 4 and really thinking about the results section, if we think of it that way, as an integrated analysis where we're weaving together data in the context of prior knowledge, and we're trying to give voice to the participants or the data sets. Sometimes the data I'm dealing with are a few steps removed from a live person. It might be I'm looking at websites or I'm doing a qualitative analysis of policy documents. So when I say participant, it's not necessarily a person. It could be an artifact of a person. So that's kind of the space that I want to talk through with you today. And I thought I would just mention at the top some of the most common pain points that come through this writing. And as I go through the presentation, I've actually brought some examples of pain points. I like to show people the kinds of reviews that we sometimes get from reviewers because we learn a lot through that lens. I think, first of all, a lot of us now are working in more interdisciplinary teams, and even for those people that are very truly, you know, I'm a qualitative researcher, you may find yourself on mixed teams, and you may be in a position where you've got to also be publishing papers with people who may have very little knowledge of qualitative. So it's actually really useful to be having this conversation in, you know, even if people think, it's not really relevant, I won't publish qualitative? Well, you might, because you will likely be on some bigger teams as you move ahead. So really thinking about how to position yourself in the team, who's going to lead that writing. Where I find we run into some issues sometimes is when the non-qualitative people set out to write the papers for the whole team, and sometimes that's just not quite the right way to go about it. There are also a good number of reviewers and editors, unfortunately, who don't have expertise in qualitative or mixed methods research. And sometimes you can get someone who really is even coming with a bit of baggage, thinking, oh, qualitative is not actually very rigorous, or it's problematic in some way. There's lots of things that people will bring to their reviewing practice that qualitative researchers sometimes are put a bit on the back foot, and we really have to defend some of our work where a quantitative researcher may not have to do that, depending on the nature of the journal. So that's just a common piece that I see. I counsel a lot of people looking for advice on how to deal with reviews. So I just wanted to throw it out there that I try to be proactive in my writing style to anticipate some of those challenges. Journals are also sometimes designed very much for a quantitative approach. So you may find that it's very difficult to work with the small word count. And I'm finding, despite online journals and the fact that, there's no real word count in an online environment, our journal lengths are shrinking. I'm seeing more and more journals that are going down to 7,500 words, 5,000 words. This becomes very difficult for qualitative writers, and we have to be very creative in how we write. There's often also an expectation that we should be putting things into tables, that we should be doing lists and counting things and doing things in a certain way that's really better for a quantitative approach, as Andrew was explaining. We certainly do count things. I count things all the time. And sometimes I'm using a number like saying 100% of participants said this. We don't avoid numbers, but we don't focus on it. The goal is not to be that reductionist. The goal is something else. And I'm going to show you a bit of a window into what that something else looks like. So for me, I've started actually calling this an integrated approach very purposefully, and even using that language now when I'm writing my papers or when I'm talking to reviewers and editors. Part of it is because qualitative writing is very much a part of the entire practice of doing qualitative work. When I'm engaged in data collection, I'm already taking field notes. I'm already starting to write some of the analyses. I'm doing some whiteboarding with my team. I'm really starting to already think about what that final product of writing is going to look like. And it really helps me to build the frame for the papers that are going to emerge later. And sometimes there will be 4 or 5 papers out of one project rather than a single report, for example. So I'm trying to map out, what are my points of focus? How am I going to approach this? And so we don't we definitely sit down to write the paper, but there's usually a lot of writing that's already been developed. The goal overall is to really give voice to participants. So I'm very mindful when I'm writing and when I'm starting to think about what the paper sections will look like, that I have to strike a balance between my voice, which is the interpretive voice, and the voice of what I call the discipline, all the research that's come before, and then the voice of the people or the documents or the artifacts that I've engaged in my data collection and my analysis work. And I'm trying to privilege as much as I can the voice of the data, the voice of the participants, but it's not just about a flat descriptive, here's what they said, because it's here's what they've said, this is what this means, this is how we might explore this in the context of what we have already known. And it points to interesting, sometimes we're finding points of conflict. Sometimes it's gaps in the existing literature, and we're filling those gaps. So wherever possible, I'm including often very lengthy quotes, excerpts, images, trying to draw as much as I can into the document. One of the questions I often get is around pseudonyms and numbers, and in very, very quantitative disciplines, you'll see people saying, participant number 1 said this, and participant number 8 said that. It doesn't really kind of mesh with a qualitative approach that really privileges the whole person and the real person. So pseudonyms are typically the default that most qualitative writers will use, but of course, sometimes we're using people's real names. We can disclose people. The key thing is we sort that out as part of our ethical practice. That's included in the ethics applications. And then when I'm writing, I may have very different approaches depending on how the project was done. I also try to use, wherever I can, the language of the person. So if it's their terminology, their concepts are sometimes important, as well as materials that they may have provided in data collection. Sometimes we also review material with our participants just to see that I've got it right, I've kind of interpreted things correctly, but certainly thinking of more of a postmodern relativist approach to thinking of this kind of interpretive work, many people don't use any member checking because it's really trying to speak to that interpretive voice of the researcher. So there's not one size fits all in terms of how we manage that, but there are certainly some trends and options depending on the discipline and the methodology. So I thought I'd give you just a few examples of some of the direct advice that I give to people. One of the first ones is to start with something that I call analytic headings. So when I'm writing a paper, and you'll see this in analysis, sometimes people will say, you know, they'll know that they need some headings, but they tend to use headings like they might say, oh, you know, the movies, or just a very descriptive headline on the section that doesn't really explain what it is you're going to get into. So it might just say, you know, collaborative research or support. And it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? I always try to give a bit of a teaser in these headings to kind of give you a heads up on the content that's going to come. So instead of just saying, oh, collaborative research, I've made a heading here that is about piloting best practice in collaborative research. So making the point of where am I going with this section? The second one is not just saying supports, but that there's a need for tangible supports and recognition. And this also helps me as a writer, because if you can frame it in a short heading, what the goal of that section is, it really focuses your mind around what, you know, what's the story I'm telling again? Oh, right, I'm talking about data where people have shown the need for tangible supports in order to do the work that they need to do. So it can also be a filter and a help to the writer. But when a reader is reading the paper, it kind of leads them through the analysis in a way that kind of helps with flow. And it's important because when you're writing, sometimes you're not even quite sure which theme to put first or how to tell that story. And these kinds of section by section breakdowns can help you to figure out which order things should be placed in. So to give you an example of what this looks like, I've grabbed just an excerpt here from the second theme, which was around the need for tangible supports. So this project was really looking at practitioners and academics coming together on collaborative research projects. And in this particular theme, I'm talking about practitioners and the way that they do need support from their employers to help them to do the work of doing research. So often when I'm writing this kind of work, I'm starting the section with a bit of an overall statement, bringing in my interpretation of the work and kind of framing it for the reader so they know where this theme is going to go. Then I provide some perspectives from the data set, from the participants, and then I integrate the literature as part of my analytic framing. So here, as an example, my voice is up at the front, basically saying, look, in supporting collaborations, a key point was that they needed support, right? The role of their organizations in supporting this collaborative work was important. And, you know, moving through, we start to see, okay, you know, research was not a part of practitioners' roles. The supports that they got were really limited, especially compared to academics. And then I'm linking that into the literature. So I'm saying, you know, that in the literature, when we look at that, the two most common things that pop up are lack of time and insufficient managerial support. So in this case, the theme is actually confirming some things that we've already been finding in the literature. And then what I do is I provide some concrete examples. So, and in this case, these are two practitioners. I use these little headings of practitioner Nicole and practitioner Matt, because the rest of the paper also had academics. So I wanted to distinguish the two types of participants for the reader. And in many cases, sometimes it's these very quick quotes, which is what you're getting with Nicole there, where I've crafted the sentence to include short little phrases. And then with the Matt example, that happens to be a longer embedded quote that gives a little bit more context. So I tend to use a mix of these approaches when I write. Sometimes I just need a quick little lovely catchphrase. Other times I need to map the whole story or a little bit more context for someone to understand what that participant's trying to get across. Another key point is that sometimes, especially when we're going through peer reviews, sometimes when you're writing papers, you're so close to it, you can't even see the forest for the trees, as they say. In another paper, and I have given the links to both of these papers on my final slide, so you'll be able to look them up later if you wish. In another paper, what was really interesting, and you'll see that this one is labeled figure 13, we actually had about 15 or 20 images from the data set that we analyzed in this particular project. But what was missing was a figure that would actually pull the model together. So we had developed a model, but we hadn't actually visually modeled it. How ironic. That just seems like such a well duh kind of a moment. We should have thought of this. But in this case, a reviewer of the initial draft of the paper identified what the contribution was, but then they requested something that was a little more visual. And so I loved that feedback, and I happened to be co-authoring with someone in design, which was very lucky. So he went away and he came up just with this quick visual representation that really, when you see it in the context of the whole paper, it just ties everything together. So there's absolutely opportunity for us in qualitative writing to be creating some interesting images and different approaches. It's just a matter of how to do that, what's the best way, depending on the work that we've got. Oops, just clicking here. What's interesting, though, is that for that same paper, and this is from a different reviewer of that same paper, one of the first challenges, and I have had this happen to me, not all the time, but every once in a while, a reviewer will pop up and say kind of, oh, yes, great paper, like the paper. However, you must separate your findings and discussions sections. These should not be together. They should be separated. And whenever I see this, rightly or wrongly, I always say to myself, oh dear, here's a quantitative researcher who has been gifted my paper. And as Andrew said, they're used to a separated model, and this is what they want to see. And the challenge with this is that a lot of qualitative researchers can spend a lot of time trying to separate. And not only is that extremely difficult, it actually really does not do justice to the content. To me, it's an integrity issue in terms of qualitative writing. So I have actually worked very hard over my career to find some phrasings and some examples to kind of push back on this. And it's partly because my discipline is very mixed in its approaches, so you never know quite who you're going to get. And because a lot of journal editors pick people because of their content expertise, not their methodology, you can pop up with a reviewer who just doesn't understand. So I always do push back. These are a couple of references if you're looking for some things to point to give you some justification. Which is always a little bit of evidence, always helps. So when I push back on this one, here's what I said to the editor. And so when we do a response table, often people don't quite know what to say, and you have to do it obviously very carefully. But in this case, I also knew that the editor of the journal was a quantitative researcher who actually preferred things to be separated. So with this journal, every time I submit to this journal, this editor asks me to separate. And every time I come back and I say, no, thank you, I will not do so. And so it's an interesting dance that we've been doing, but that's okay. So what I've said here is just, that this is not, it's not what we do. The integration is a critical aspect of trustworthiness. As the findings are not independent of our interpretation, it's not a preference, it's not a choice, it's kind of how we do things. And softly point out that the journal itself actually publishes many things with integrated findings, including stuff I've written myself. So, and interestingly, each time they've been accepting of this argument. And then, but what I did this time was I also, I also made some other points here around, that people may not be familiar with this, and therefore we decided to provide some additional content in the body of the paper itself. So this is the excerpt that I've written into the paper at the start of my results section to basically position this. And I thought, okay, I'm going to use this as a teaching opportunity for other people that pick up this paper. And now I refer to it then as this integrated analysis. I quote from the 2 citations I gave you just a minute ago to really ground it and really explain to people how qualitative writing is meant to work and how we make that happen. The second challenge that I wanted to flag is around the concept of limitations, because this is another one where particularly kind of postmodern scholars, would argue that every study is limited. The idea that it's not limited is silly. Of course it's limited, but the way that we kind of talk about it in a lot of our writing tends to be quite different to what you see in quantitative work. And for example, many of us will get critiqued in peer review around small samples, lack of generalizability, all of these concepts that are really coming from understandings of rigor in quantitative frameworks that don't actually apply to qualitative. So we often have to really kind of do a bit of a dance again around how to handle these kinds of questions. I use an entirely separate language of rigor in qualitative writing. So for example, I don't talk about generalizability, I talk about transferability. I don't talk about rigor and validity, reliability and validity. I talk about dependability and other measures of rigor. I also talk a lot about exploratory because I do a lot of exploratory work. And of course, those will require larger or different samples as well. But I try to do this in a way that is very positive and talk about what the project has done rather than framing it in a deficit model. So for example, here I've mapped out some of those elements, explaining about the exploratory and the small scale of the study, and also then explaining what a larger scale program of research could do. But at the end of the day, I want to focus on the fact that it provides a starting point. There will be some transferability coming out of the project, but a lot of it is about opening the door to future work, and that in its own right is a valuable endeavor. Whew, whirlwind tour. So I'll maybe just try to stop sharing for the moment, but I know that you'll have those slides will be coming through because this is being recorded, so you'll be able to find those, and we've got maybe 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much. That was great and very, if you've been listening to both of us, very different pieces of advice, but that's because they're very different methodological approaches. Fantastic. Yeah, I certainly have a few questions about qual, but yeah. I will let everyone else have first crack first.
I would like to be the first.
Maria, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
To answer a lot of questions, or explain in a better way many of the issues I have been facing by writing qualitative papers. But probably one of the biggest issues is, and you mentioned that in your presentation, is the number of words. Usually I am over the number of words. At this moment, I'm fighting with 2 papers where I need to somehow cut like 3,000 words because, the explanation is very different. So once you finish the introduction, the methodology, in the methodology, you need to explain it a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what do we do in this? Yeah, what do we do?
Then, so the heart of the paper is fundings. And then you need to cut fundings as well. And then you are, oh my God, this is not exactly what.
So I have some suggestions. And the first one is you definitely want to privilege the findings section. So one of the things that I do when I'm writing in a short way is I cut back introduction, lit review, methodology. I keep those as tight and concise as I possibly can in order to privilege the findings and results and maybe a bit of the conclusions. And what's interesting, so this is one of these like insider tips I have learned, is that when you do that and people love the paper and they're excited about it, they will then ask you to put other content in as part of revision. They'll say, oh, lovely, so amazing. There needs to be a bit more in the methodology, or I wish you'd given us a bit more here in the literature review. Revisions don't really count into the word count. And so many editors then will let, you're not restricted by that word count when they're asking you to add stuff. You got to add stuff, right? Because they've asked for it. So I've learned this over time that you can stretch your word count, ironically enough, by tightening that front end. If it's a solid paper and they want it, you're good. The other strategy is sometimes a paper can be cut into two parts. And if you reach out to editors, they may do one of two things. They may sometimes give you space to have a part 1, part 2 in a journal. So they may accept two papers that kind of are meant to be published together. Or if you explain what it is, especially explaining the methodological approach, they may just give you more space than is typical for the journal. So reaching out to the editor and asking for a bit more word count is useful. It's sometimes, sadly, we simply pick different journals. If people are not open and willing, and we can't write 3,000 words to do it justice, go somewhere else. But the problem is sometimes we're trying to get into a top tier journal. We really want it, it's important to have something in a certain venue. Then you've got to make choices. And you may have to scale back the amount of topics that you cover. But I try the first few tricks and the dancing first.
Thank you very much.
I find the American journals are much more flexible when it comes to word count than the European journals, which typically have about an 8,000 word, including references, limit. But as Lisa pointed out, when you're actually doing revisions, you can stretch that up to 10,000 usually, and they don't put up a fight.
That's right. And I do other sneaky things, like if I'm really editing the word count. So I usually write the paper, see where it lands, might be 10,000 words. And then I start cutting it back. And sometimes I will cut out selected references. If the word count includes references, that's the easiest way to get your word count down. So instead of giving 3 examples of the literature, I cite 2 examples. Because you know what? If they think it's not enough, they'll ask you for more citations. So I have some little tricks like that on editing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Marco, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Lisa, for the presentation. I would love to hear this presentation when I was doing my PhD, which was very qualitative, and it would save me lots of issues. But anyway, better later than ever. So, thanks, Lisa. And based on this kind of experience, I want to ask you, probably a provocative question, in a sense. If a young researcher or someone that starts a PhD has to decide to do to pursue and become a qualitative researcher or a quantitative researcher. Now, this is probably the biggest question that I've been asked myself, and I've been asked by other people, younger scholar. And the answer is, I start as a qualitative person, and then suddenly I realize after many failure that you have many more chances to publish if your paper is quantitative rather than qualitative. So in a sense, to have the same outcome, qualitative person has to fight probably 10 times more than a quantitative person. And probably, regardless the nature of the question, probably that's why we now have mixed method. So then we try to give something. Now, the question I guess for you is what do you think, and what would you say to someone that has to shape their career? Which one should I pursue?
Good
so
question.
It's a great question. And so when I was doing my PhD, I really wanted to do qualitative research. And my supervisor said to me, look around our discipline. You cannot yet do a fully qualitative thesis. You can't. It's not going to pass muster. So I did a combination thesis. I did qualitative interviews. I did a big quantitative analysis of census data, and I did discourse analysis because I also was a postmodernist. I wanted to do critical discourse analysis as well. So I designed a mixed methods project, and that was amazing. Looking back, it gave me the guts of each methodological approach enough that I could start to work across disciplines, and it gave me that credibility. So I actually advise people really, like, don't think of yourself as a quantitative or a qualitative researcher. It's what is the problem that you're examining, and what do you need to do to understand that? That might lead you to a qualitative design, but it doesn't preclude other designs, right? I definitely work with students to say, scale it down so that it's manageable, but that could be some interviews and some textual work, or some interviews and a small survey, or, you know, if they want that experience, right? I also look at their background. If you've done all sorts of stuff in a quantitative thing in your job, you should take the qualitative thing in the PhD when you've got a support network to help you with it, and then you've already got, because a lot of people will go, oh, I've only ever done quant, so I'll do quant for my PhD. So I try to personalize the advice. And I don't think qual has to fight necessarily. It depends on the venues and the discipline. So, and it looks different in nursing compared to education, you know?
Yeah.
Yep.
I hope that helps.
Yep. Thanks.
But I love qual. I mean, you know, I love working with people.
I love
right?
that too.
And if you're a people person, like, why do you want to sit down and just play with coding and numbers? And, you know, you probably don't. So it's got to be the paradigm of the person as well that needs to kind of, you know, where's your heart, right?
Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa.
We have about 1 minute left, so if there's a quick question for Lisa, we can slide that one in.
Otherwise, Andrew wants to ask one.
I do. There is one I want to ask. It has to do with this concept of data saturation, because I've heard that there's a paper out there that says that you reach data saturation with qualitative research after about 8 respondents. But if you submit a paper to a journal with only 8 respondents, you get laughed out of the room. And I'm wondering, like, how much is enough these days for qualitative studies?
Enough? It's interesting because I haven't seen the one with 8, so I'd be interested to see that one. I mean, I think most of the studies I've read over time put the boundary around 15 to 22, 15 to 25 is usually the safety zone. And the way I explain it to people is like, okay, there's reaching saturation, and then there's like add a few more for a safety net, you know? So I generally, and it depends on how many other kinds of data you've got. So I think you could get away with 8 or 10 interviews if you also have policy documents you've assessed, or, you know, if you've got that triangulation.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't maybe publish about 8 interviews, but I might publish 8 key informants plus these other things and look at the themes. Or I might publish 8 as a pilot study or exploratory and kind of soften my, you know, what can I say in terms of transferability? The other problem is 8 only works with a super homogeneous grouping. So you can't then make claims about gender differences or contextual differences or background, right? You could potentially do that around a really tight case study and be fine.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. What can I say? That was a fantastic session, Lisa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you want to just give a quick plug for your ECP at the end here?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I should do that, right? So I am director of the Social Change ECP. Obviously, we do very interdisciplinary work, but it's very human focused. It's very much about how do we make change in the world in a variety of different disciplines. If you're not an affiliate, please join us. We will also be doing, for Social Sciences Week, I'm on a panel on the 7th of September at 2 o'clock, where we're going to be talking about research practices for social change. So we'll talk about a little bit ethics, a little bit methodology, a little bit who knows what. So come along to that.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Thanks everyone who
My
came,
pleasure.
and thanks to those who are listening subsequently to the recording. We'll see you at the next session.
Is it okay if we contact you? You know, if we have more questions? Sorry, Andrew.
Sure. Yeah, reach out. No
I
worries.
am building more questions in my mind.